Like, subscribe, and ring the bell. Let's go!
But before we dive into the topic, I feel compelled to analyze a term I'll be using throughout today's video. That is motor unit recruitment. For a muscle to contract, our brain has to send an electric impulse that innervates a group of muscle fibers through motor neurons. A motor unit is the combined system of the motor neuron connected with the muscle fibers it contracts. A motor neuron can innervate a spectrum of muscle fibers, varying from slow twitch to fast twitch. The force requirement of a movement ultimately determines which type of muscle fiber will be innervated. A low motor unit recruitment threshold as default makes sense because we can complete tasks using the least amount of energy. Think about walking, getting up from a chair, open a door, or lifting a glass to drink water. Therefore, the body always wants to recruit these smaller and weaker muscle fibers first. They are not very powerful, but they can work for longer. The bigger, fast-twitch muscle fibers will only be recruited if the slow-twitch type aren't enough to handle a given task. This typically happens when we are in a situation that demands a high level of force production, like resistance training. So the more demanding the task is, the more muscle fibers are used. In these situations, the motor unit recruitment threshold is high. Now, if your goal is to put on some muscle on your frame, you will need to train hard enough to stimulate the fast-twitch muscle fibers. These are going to be your true growers. But beware that your body will not want to use the bigger, more explosive muscle fibers unless you force it to. It's your job to make that happen. Alright, once we understand this key principle, now let's take a look at the old fitness dilemma on what's the best rep range to build muscle. But first, a little bit of myth busting. For many years, it was widely accepted in the fitness world that there was an optimal range for muscle growth. Anything below 6 reps and you'd be doing strength work, and any set going above 12 reps and you'd be improving your muscular endurance. Today we all know that this picture is just an oversimplification of how things work, and the reality is a little bit more nuanced than that. When it comes to hypertrophy training, aka building muscle, you can achieve significant muscle development using a wide spectrum of rep ranges. Any set going from 1 to 30 plus reps has the potential to trigger muscle synthesis. The only requirement for this to happen is that your level of effort is high, really high. I'm talking about near maximum effort. Consistently reaching proximity to failure in a progressively harder training protocol is the simplest way to ensure that you give your body no other option but to grow. As you get closer to this muscle adaptation threshold during a set, you gradually recruit more and more motor units, so that you can keep doing reps in a more fatigued state. Maximal to near maximal motor unit recruitment only happens towards the end of the set, when reps slow down significantly or the athlete has to grind through a sticking point somewhere. This is a pretty good example of what the vast majority of your set should look like at the end of the training block if your goal is to maximize muscular development through resistance training. So, simply put, numbers don't play any significant role in the muscle building process unless a specific effort level is met. That threshold is proximity to concentric failure, meaning the inability to perform one more repetition in a given exercise. The point where, gun to your head, you cannot physically complete another repetition. If your goal is purely to add muscle mass, leaving 2 to 0 reps in reserve seems to be a general rule of thumb that would serve the average gym goer pretty well in the majority of situations. Quite frankly, a novice lifter who's new to resistance training doesn't need to push a set as hard as I'm showing you in this video. Leaving 3 to 4 reps in reserve will be stimulatory enough for him to make significant gains at the start. However, there is something you should know about rep ranges. Everything I've said so far holds true from a theoretical standpoint. You could build muscle through low, moderate, and high numbers of repetitions for as long as you get close to concentric failure. But from a practical point of view, it seems like the bros got this one right. After all, they walked the walk for many years. So the 6 to 12 rep range is not the hypertrophy magic spot, as many bodybuilders claimed, but it turns out to be, if not the best, the most optimal rep range from a practical perspective when you take everything into account. The first variable to factor in is time. Today we know that as long as tonnage is equal, you can accomplish the same hypertrophic results working at different intensities. But whereas trainee A only requires 3 to 4 minutes to recover from set to set, trainee B might need 5 to 8 minutes before completing the next set of 3 repetitions. This is simply because trainee B is trying to do the same amount of work than trainee A, but with less repetitions. A third less to be exact. So, if we take an average rest time of 3.5 minutes and 5.5 minutes respectively, the first athlete would require roughly 10 minutes to complete the prescribed work, whereas athlete B would require somewhere around 40 minutes in total to complete the same amount of work.
Ain't nobody got time for that.
Yes, the two trainees would achieve the same results if you only look at hypertrophic gains. But from a time efficiency perspective, the first rep scheme is much faster. The closer you work from your 1 repetition max, the longer you'd have to rest between sets. In sum, lowering the intensity would make a lot of practical sense for most people. You can get so much more done in less time with lighter weights. And ultimately, that's also the reason why some fellas fail to accumulate enough training volume to cause hypertrophy, because they are constantly using very high intensities. Fatigue is also a key consideration when analyzing these two different routes. Higher loads are more stressful on the joints than work being done with lower intensities. Lifting heavy exposes your bodily structure to very high levels of mechanical tension, and it takes much longer for tendons and ligaments to handle that kind of stress. Your muscles could recover from session to session just fine, but connective tissue takes much longer to heal. Another crucial factor is technique proficiency. The requirement for excellent execution should be at par with the numbers on the bar. The heavier you go, the better your technique should be. Form breakdown at 70% of your 1 rep max does not carry the same risk potential that one at 90%. This situation is a key incentive for the athlete to stay within a more moderate rep range. Go a little bit lighter if you're not confident about your execution in a lift yet. You might not be the guy lifting the heaviest weight, but who cares? You are more likely to keep coming to the gym for longer, and consistency trumps intensity over the long run. And someone clever in the audience might think, well, what would happen on the other side of the spectrum? What if I just lower the intensity even further down and complete all my work in just 1 or 2 sets? Wouldn't that be even more time efficient? Wouldn't that also be easier on the joints? In theory, yes, but in practical terms, this could be counterproductive. Now you have to account for other factors that have nothing to do with the desired motor unit recruitment threshold you like to reach every single set. In this particular scenario, it's very likely for many people that their cardiovascular system becomes now the limiting factor. Have you ever tried to reach near muscular failure doing back squats with less than 50% of your 1 rep max? Well, I have, and that was just brutal. I was sore for 5 days. It was ridiculous. This is only something that you would do as an experiment once a year, by the way. You can't train like this. It's unsustainable. Unless you have a decent work capacity, you're more likely to stop the set not because your muscles are working at maximal effort of their capacity, but because your cardiovascular system cannot keep up. Now the limiting factor is not muscular fatigue, but cardiovascular fatigue. If your cardio gives up before your muscles do, you're not taking a set to a point of maximal motor unit recruitment. And however brutal near-death experience that set felt like, it's not going to do much for you in terms of muscle growth, to be honest. For that super high rep, high bar example, I could have gotten a very similar amount of muscle synthesis by increasing the load significantly and perform 4 sets instead. If that was to be the case, not only would I make my training more enjoyable and sustainable, but I would also manage local fatigue much better. Higher reps produce more metabolic waste, inflammation, and muscle soreness, and this could be detrimental to your adherence to the program in general, and performance during that exercise in particular. Training with higher intensities and less repetitions might allow you to train squats only 2 to 3 days after. In other words, you could train this movement more frequently. However, the very high rep option might prevent you from training the same body part as often. You might need 4 to 6 days to be fully recovered from the grueling sets you put yourself through the last time. Even if that set only lasted for roughly 2 to 3 minutes. Yes, it got the job done much faster, but it wasn't worth it from a stimulus to fatigue ratio point of view. Yes, the super high rep set was very stimulatory from a muscle growth perspective, no doubt about it, but the amount of fatigue I had to accrue for that stimulus was also very significant, to the point where another lower body session in the same week was very unlikely. If you're someone who wants to squat 3 times per week or train your lower body at least twice, these routes could be detrimental to your frequency goals. Additionally, even if you perform sets with moderate intensities and high to very high repetitions, you need to remember that the goal is still to reach maximal motor unit recruitment. A lower rep range allows you to perform muscle building reps almost from the get-go, whereas you might have to complete very large numbers of quote-unquote junk reps just to finally put yourself in an environment that is conducive to hypertrophy. So, given all the reasons I laid out in this video, it seems like planning the majority of your training around the 5 to 6 to 10 to 12 rep range is the most optimal way to train for the average gym rat who wants to build some muscle mass and get stronger overall. Does this mean, however, that we should ditch other rep schemes altogether? The answer is no. We could occasionally prioritize both the lower and upper side of the spectrum depending on your fitness level, specific goals, personal preferences, and exercise selection. Maybe you find your own training style and something that suits you better. In fact, I'm going to argue that if your favorite intensity range deviates slightly to the lower or upper sides of this theoretical spectrum, that's no problem at all. Keep doing whatever you enjoy the most, especially if that's going to ensure that you keep coming back to the gym. If sets of 15 plus reps make you miserable and you spend the following days looking like a zombie dragging yourself around, then you don't have to do it. Long-term adherence to a program is much more important than training within a quote-unquote optimal rep range for muscle growth. You don't want to end up hating every minute of your time in the gym. Look, the truth of the matter is that everyone has different muscle fiber distribution, and therefore people will respond very differently to the same stimulus. If you're fast-twitch muscle fiber dominant, you might prefer spending the vast majority of your training within the 3 to 8 rep range. You could make impressive strength and hypertrophy progress if you find out that you thrive on very high intensities that require great rates of force production. I personally feel the most comfortable with more moderate intensities. Given that I'm naturally more slow-twitch muscle fiber, I shine when the game is not so much about how much I can lift, but rather how many times and how long I can lift a given weight. For this reason alone, I tend to spend a big chunk of my training working within the 8 to 15 repetition range. That doesn't mean that I completely ignore the lower end of the rep spectrum, of course. In fact, if you've been following me for a while, you know already that I took part in a local powerlifting meet in the pre-apocalyptic world. If everything goes back to normal in 2021, then I'll compete again at the end of this year. Another important variable I like to bring to your attention is exercises, and more specifically, the number of joints and muscle mass involved in a given movement. It makes very little sense to employ a low rep number for a single joint movement that engages very little muscle mass. I'm thinking about side delt raises or bicep curls, just to name two common examples. For those type of movements, a high repetition count is more suitable. Using lower reps when targeting small areas of the body would only encourage cheating, given how mechanically disadvantageous the movement is. On the other hand, the more joint action is required to execute a given movement, the more muscle mass we bring into that movement. Squats and deadlifts come to mind. These type of exercises lend themselves to lower rep range as mechanical tension gets dispersed across a large area of your body. Given how much muscle mass is engaged in these type of movements, the cardiovascular fitness of the athlete must be good enough to handle large numbers of repetitions, as I previously mentioned. Finally, the last factor I take into consideration as a personal trainer is the athlete's experience with resistance training. As someone who works with untrained novices leading sedentary lifestyles, I don't think it's very productive to subject the person to intensities above 85% at the start. As a matter of fact, I'd rather have them spend most of their time working on the lighter side of the spectrum. That gives them more opportunities to ingrain specific movement patterns in each session. And that's also an easier environment for them to learn how to engage multiple parts of their body in a more coordinated manner. After a while, once they've built a base and they are more comfortable with that movement, only then I would increase the intensity.
Alright, peeps of the intraweb, I really hope you found value in today's video. If you learned something new and you want to show me some appreciation, which is very welcome by the way, go ahead and smash the like button, don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell to get notified every time a new video goes live. And more good stuff is coming up soon. I gotta go eat. In the meantime, stay fit, stay strong, give me a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more gains. Peace! Peace!